At this point, Stephanie White may never beat the allegations, because no matter how many games the Indiana Fever win, no matter how many times Caitlin Clark saves the day, and no matter how many positive speeches come out of the locker room, one question just keeps coming back. Why does it always feel like everybody gets praised except Caitlin Clark? That's the question many Fever fans were asking after Indiana escaped with another victory. Yes, they won. Yes, Aaliyah Boston had a career night. Yes, there were positives to take away, but there was also a blown 19-point lead. There was overtime against one of the worst teams in the league, and once again, there was Caitlin Clark quietly putting together another huge performance, finishing with a double-double and accounting for an enormous chunk of Indiana's offense. Yet when Stephanie White addressed the team afterward, many fans noticed something. Or rather, they noticed someone. Because according to critics, there was no special recognition for the player who continues to carry the franchise. No mention of another double-double. No mention of the two-woman game with Aaliyah Boston that looked unstoppable at times. No mention of the player who many believe saved Indiana from another embarrassing collapse. And that's why social media immediately exploded. Not because the Fever lost, they won. Not because Clark played poorly, she didn't. But because supporters have become convinced that this isn't an isolated incident anymore. They believe there's a pattern. They believe Stephanie White consistently goes out of her way to praise everyone around Caitlin Clark while treating Clark's greatness as if it's just expected. And that's where this story becomes fascinating, because the criticism isn't just about one post-game speech. It's about months of frustration. It's about offensive philosophy. It's about rotations. It's about substitutions. It's about who gets the final shot. It's about who gets defended publicly. And perhaps most importantly, it's about whether the biggest star in women's basketball is truly being treated like the biggest star in women's basketball. Because after another double-double, another near collapse, and another emotional overtime win, some Fever fans aren't asking whether Stephanie White can coach. They're asking something much harsher. Can she ever escape the allegations that she simply doesn't appreciate Caitlin Clark the way everyone else does? And judging by the reaction after this game, a growing number of supporters believe they already know the answer. And honestly, that's what makes the whole situation so strange, because this isn't about Caitlin Clark needing constant praise. Nobody is saying every post-game speech has to become a love letter to number 22. Nobody is saying Aaliyah Boston shouldn't be celebrated after dropping 34 points. In fact, most Fever fans were thrilled for Boston. A career-high performance deserves recognition, but supporters are asking a much different question. Why does it always seem like Caitlin Clark's greatness gets treated differently? Because, let's be honest, another double-double from Clark isn't exactly shocking anymore. Another game where she creates offense for everybody else isn't shocking either. But that's part of the problem. Many supporters believe Stephanie White has become so accustomed to Clark doing extraordinary things that those things are now treated as ordinary. And when extraordinary starts becoming ordinary, people begin taking greatness for granted. That's why social media exploded after the post-game comments. Fans weren't upset because White praised the team. They weren't upset because she highlighted Boston. They were upset because they felt the player who once again accounted for a massive portion of Indiana's offense seemed to disappear from the conversation altogether. Fair or unfair, that's how many supporters interpreted it. And once people start believing there's a pattern, every new incident simply reinforces what they already think. The irony is that Caitlin Clark herself probably doesn't care nearly as much as the fans do. Time and time again, she's been quick to praise teammates. She's been quick to celebrate Aaliyah Boston. She's been quick to deflect attention. That's part of why teammates love playing with her. But supporters see things differently. They view Clark as the engine of the franchise. And because of that, they expect the organization and the coaching staff to treat her accordingly. When they don't see that reflected publicly, the criticism comes fast. And honestly, that's why Stephanie White finds herself in such a difficult position, because she isn't just coaching a basketball team anymore. She's coaching the team that employs the biggest star in the league. Every quote gets analyzed. Every substitution gets questioned. Every decision gets debated. And when your fan base already believes you have an issue with Caitlin Clark, even something as simple as leaving her name out of a post-game speech becomes another piece of evidence. That's why many supporters aren't saying Stephanie White made one mistake. They're saying she keeps feeding the allegations, and right now, they believe she's doing herself absolutely no favors. But honestly, this conversation goes far beyond post-game speeches. Because many Fever supporters believe the real issue isn't what Stephanie White says, it's what she does. And that's where the criticism becomes much more intense. Take the offense, for example. Anybody watching the Fever over the last several games has seen it. When Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston are running their two-player game, opposing defenses look completely overwhelmed. The chemistry is obvious. The timing is obvious. The results are obvious. Clark herself has talked about how much more they can do with those actions. Fans see it, analysts see it, and yet many supporters still feel like the Fever repeatedly go away from something that clearly works. That's why so many people were frustrated watching Aaliyah Boston take 26 shots. Now, don't misunderstand that criticism. Boston had a huge night. 34 points is 34 points. She deserves credit, but some fans couldn't help but wonder why the offense still feels so complicated. Why not let Clark and Boston become the foundation of everything? Why not lean into the combination that's producing results? Why does it sometimes feel like the Fever are searching for answers they already have? That's where the Kelsey Mitchell conversation comes into play as well. Some supporters believe Indiana needs a more dominant front court presence. Others believe the roster itself isn't the problem. They believe the issue is maximizing the talent that's already there. But regardless of where fans stand, there's one thing almost everybody agrees on. The Caitlin Clark-Aaliyah Boston partnership should be the centerpiece of the franchise. Not one option among many, the centerpiece. And honestly, that's why the overtime game against Chicago left so many fans scratching their heads. Because this wasn't a showdown with the Liberty. This wasn't the Lynx. This wasn't the Aces. It was a struggling Sky team, yet Indiana blew a huge lead and found themselves fighting for survival. To supporters, that wasn't proof of resilience. It was proof that something is wrong. They look at the roster, they look at Clark, they look at Boston, and they ask themselves how a team with this much talent can continue making life so difficult for itself. Which brings us back to Stephanie White. Because every close game, every blown lead, every strange rotation, and every post-game comment eventually circles back to the same person. Fair or unfair, coaches are judged by results. And while the Fever are winning games, many fans don't believe they're winning the right way. They believe Caitlin Clark's brilliance is covering up flaws that should have been fixed a long time ago. And that's why the allegations just won't go away. Because as long as Clark keeps producing and the team keeps looking inconsistent, supporters are going to keep asking the same question. Is Stephanie White maximizing Caitlin Clark, or is Caitlin Clark maximizing Stephanie White? And honestly, that's why some Fever supporters have reached a conclusion that would have sounded absolutely crazy a few months ago. They believe Caitlin Clark is saving Stephanie White more than Stephanie White is helping Caitlin Clark. Now that's a harsh statement. And it's certainly one that Stephanie White's defenders would reject immediately. After all, coaches don't make shots. Coaches don't grab rebounds. Coaches don't force turnovers. At the end of the day, players have to execute. That's true, but fans aren't judging White based solely on wins and losses anymore. They're judging her based on what they believe this team should be capable of. And in their minds, this team should be terrifying. Not surviving, terrifying. Because let's look at the talent. You have Caitlin Clark, the biggest star in the sport and arguably the greatest offensive weapon women's basketball has seen in years. You have Aaliyah Boston, an all-star caliber big who just dropped a career-high 34 points. You have Kelsey Mitchell, one of the best scorers in the league. You have quality role players. On paper, this shouldn't be a team struggling to put away the Chicago Sky. This shouldn't be a team blowing 19-point leads. And it certainly shouldn't be a team needing overtime to escape one of the league's weakest rosters. That's where the frustration comes from, because supporters aren't complaining about a rebuilding team. They're complaining about unrealized potential. They look at Caitlin Clark accounting for massive portions of the offense night after night and wonder how much more she has to do. They see her creating open shots that don't get finished. They see her setting up teammates for easy buckets. They see the chemistry developing with Aaliyah Boston, and they see a formula that appears to work, which is why they become frustrated whenever the offense moves away from what they believe should be its identity. And honestly, perhaps the most damaging thing for Stephanie White is perception, because perception becomes reality in sports. Once fans decide something, it's incredibly difficult to change their minds. And right now, many supporters have decided that White doesn't fully appreciate what she has in Caitlin Clark. They believe she takes greatness for granted. They believe she overcomplicates things. They believe she treats extraordinary performances as business as usual. And whether those beliefs are fair or unfair almost becomes irrelevant, because once that narrative takes hold, every single game starts feeding it. That's why even positive moments turn into criticism. Aaliyah Boston scores 34 points, and the discussion becomes about Clark's assists. The Fever win, and the discussion becomes about blown leads. Stephanie White praises the team, and the discussion becomes about who she didn't praise. Everything circles back to the same debate, and that's a dangerous place for a coach to be, because when fans start viewing every success as something the players achieved in spite of the coach rather than because of the coach, the criticism becomes almost impossible to stop, and right now, that's exactly where Stephanie White finds herself. Not fighting one allegation, fighting all of them at the same time, but honestly, perhaps the most fascinating part of all of this is that Stephanie White isn't losing because the Fever are losing. She's losing because expectations have changed. That's the Caitlin Clark effect, because before Clark arrived, a hard-fought overtime win would have been celebrated. A victory was a victory. Nobody would have cared how ugly it looked. Nobody would have spent hours debating post-game speeches. Nobody would have broken down every quote and every substitution, but those days are gone. This isn't the old Indiana Fever anymore. This is the Caitlin Clark era, and with that comes expectations that are completely different from anything the franchise has experienced before. Fans don't just expect wins, they expect dominance. They don't just expect playoff appearances, they expect championships. And they don't just expect Clark to be great, they expect the organization to fully embrace that greatness. That's why supporters become frustrated when they see Clark and Boston developing what looks like one of the most dangerous two-player combinations in basketball, only for the offense to drift away from it. That's why they become frustrated when Clark creates opportunities that don't get converted. That's why they become frustrated when games against struggling opponents turn into unnecessary dramas, because in their minds, these things shouldn't be happening. Not with this roster, not with this player, not with this opportunity, and honestly, that's the word that keeps coming up. Opportunity. Because players like Caitlin Clark don't come around often. Generational players are rare. They're the kinds of athletes organizations spend decades searching for. The kind of players who change television ratings, attendance, merchandise sales, and the entire trajectory of a franchise. And when you have someone like that, fans naturally become protective. They become impatient. They become demanding. Because deep down, they're terrified of one thing: wasting the opportunity. That's the fear driving so much of this criticism. Not hatred, not negativity. Fear. Fear that the Fever are sitting on something special and aren't maximizing it. Fear that Clark is being asked to constantly rescue situations that shouldn't need rescuing. Fear that years from now, people will look back and wonder how a franchise with this much talent didn't accomplish more. And that's why Stephanie White can't seem to escape the criticism, because every time Clark puts together another incredible performance, every time she records another double-double, every time she saves the team from embarrassment, the spotlight shifts back to the coach. Not because fans dislike Stephanie White personally, but because they keep asking themselves the same question: if Caitlin Clark is this good already, how much better could the Indiana Fever be if everything around her worked as efficiently as she does? And until supporters feel like they're getting the answer to that question, the allegations aren't going anywhere. In fact, they may only get louder. And honestly, that's why Stephanie White may never beat these allegations, because at this point, it's bigger than one post-game speech. It's bigger than one substitution. It's bigger than one game against the Chicago Sky. For many Fever fans, this has become about something much larger: trust, or perhaps the lack of it, because supporters aren't questioning whether Caitlin Clark is special anymore. That debate ended a long time ago. Every game seems to bring another reminder of just how extraordinary she is. Another double-double, another clutch shot, another night where she accounts for a massive percentage of Indiana's offense. Another game where she looks like the player the entire franchise should revolve around. The question fans are asking isn't about Caitlin Clark, it's about everything around her. Is the offense maximizing her? Is the coaching maximizing her? Is the organization maximizing her? And perhaps most importantly, is her greatness being appreciated the way it should be? Because that's what so many supporters seem to fear. Not that Clark will fail, but that the opportunity surrounding her will. And that's why emotions are so high. That's why social media explodes after every game. That's why every quote gets dissected. That's why every post-game speech becomes a controversy. Because when generational players come along, expectations change forever. Just ask the Lakers with Magic. Just ask the Bulls with Jordan. Just ask the Warriors with Steph Curry. Once you have that player, ordinary success stops being enough. People expect greatness, and they expect everybody around that player to operate with the same level of urgency. Right now, many Fever supporters don't believe that's happening. Fairly or unfairly, they believe Caitlin Clark keeps saving the day while the same questions continue to follow Stephanie White. And until those questions stop, the allegations aren't going anywhere, because if Clark keeps putting up double-doubles, if Clark keeps creating offense for everyone around her, if Clark keeps carrying huge portions of the load, and if fans continue feeling like those performances are simply being treated as business as usual, then every victory, every quote, and every game is going to lead right back to the same debate. Not whether Caitlin Clark is great, everybody already knows that, but whether the Indiana Fever are truly maximizing one of the most important players the WNBA has ever seen. And right now, a growing number of fans aren't convinced. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Fever fans are being too hard on Stephanie White? Or do you believe she simply cannot beat these allegations anymore? And what about Caitlin Clark's performance? Should Stephanie White have publicly highlighted Clark's double-double and overall impact after the game? Or do you think fans are reading way too much into a post-game speech? Drop your thoughts down below. If you enjoyed this video, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because we've got more Caitlin Clark and WNBA coverage coming your way, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.